What happens when a woman in a simple grey coat is told she's not important enough to stand in a brand new billion-dollar airport terminal at the glittering dedication ceremony, surrounded by the city's elite? She is publicly humiliated, dismissed as a nobody, and ordered to step aside by a wealthy couple and an arrogant executive. They have no idea they are speaking to the quiet storm at the center of it all. They don't know her name. They don't know her story. And they certainly don't know that she holds a secret that could shatter the very foundation they're so proudly standing on. This isn't just a story about being underestimated. It's a story of devastating karma and the day the ignored finally inherited the earth. The Sterling Vance International Wing at New York's JFK Airport was the very definition of modern opulence. Sunlight streamed through colossal floor-to-ceiling windows, glinting off acres of polished Italian marble. The air smelled of new leather expensive perfume and the faint, clean scent of ozone from the state-of-the-art air filtration system. It was a cathedral of travel designed to impress, to intimidate, to announce New York's dominance on the world stage. And today was its christening. Hundreds of people milled about the grand concourse, a curated guest list of New York's finest. There were politicians in sharp suits, real estate tycoons with booming laughs, tech billionaires in their uniform of designer hoodies and socialites, who floated through the crowd like brightly colored predatory birds. Champagne flutes clinked, and the low hum of self-congratulation was the dominant soundtrack. Standing near a support column, slightly away from the main throng, was Aria Vance Sterling. She was 58, though the deep-set weariness in her eyes made her seem older. Her salt-and-pepper hair was pulled back in a simple, elegant bun, but a few stray wisps had escaped, framing a face that was more accustomed to quiet contemplation than grand social events. She wore a simple, charcoal-grey wool coat over a modest black dress. In a sea of Chanel and Brioni, she was practically invisible. She clutched a small, worn leather portfolio to her chest, her knuckles white. Inside was the speech she had agonized over for weeks, a speech she wasn't sure she had the strength to deliver. Her gaze drifted upwards past the throngs of people to the sweeping silver arches of the ceiling, designed to mimic the wingspan of a soaring bird. David would have loved it. The thought brought a familiar, sharp pang to her chest. This whole place, every beam and rivet was for him. Excuse me, you're in the way." The voice was sharp, laced with an impatience that brooked no argument. Aria turned to see a woman, perhaps a decade younger than herself, draped in a garish fuchsia coat with a fur collar that looked vaguely predatory. Her face was a mask of expensive cosmetic procedures, her lips plumped into a permanent pout. This was Caroline Wexler. Behind her stood her husband, Richard Wexler, a man whose tailored suit couldn't quite conceal the soft paunch of corporate lunches, and whose smile was a practiced predatory slash. He was the head of Wexler Capital, a private equity firm known for its aggressive, often ruthless takeovers. They were flanked by their 2 teenage children, who were both engrossed in their phones, radiating an aura of bored entitlement. Aria, startled, took a half step back. "Oh, I'm sorry, you were just standing there." Caroline snapped her eyes, doing a quick, dismissive scan of Aria's simple attire. "This is the VIP section, for guests of the Port Authority. We're trying to get to the front for the dedication." She gestured vaguely towards a velvet rope line 20 feet away, where the true inner circle was gathering. "I understand," Aria said, her voice quiet. "I'm supposed to be." Before she could finish, Caroline's son, Mason, who was trying to navigate the crowd while typing on his phone, stumbled. He bumped hard into Aria, jostling her arm. The portfolio slipped from her grasp, and a lukewarm cup of coffee she'd been nursing from the catering station sloshed down the front of her grey coat. "Oh, for heaven's sake!" Caroline exclaimed, looking not at her son but at Arya with pure disgust. "Now look what you've done. You've made a mess." Richard Wexler stepped forward, placing a proprietary hand on his wife's arm. "Caroline, darling, don't worry about it. It's just some coffee." His eyes, however, were on Arya, and they were cold and dismissive. He saw a nuisance, a piece of unimportant scenery that was cluttering up his path to prominence. "She needs to move," Carolyn insisted, her voice rising. "Someone should really be checking invitations more carefully. This area is for donors and distinguished guests, not for people just wandering in off the street." The insult hung in the air, sharp and ugly. Arya felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks. She bent down to retrieve her portfolio, the damp stain on her coat feeling like a brand of shame. As she straightened up, a man in a crisp dark blue suit with a JFK Port Authority pin on his lapel strode over, a look of harried importance on his face. This was Marcus Thorne, the assistant terminal director. Ambitious, sycophantic, and possessed of an unerring instinct for siding with whomever he perceived to hold the most power. "Is there a problem here?" Thorne asked, his gaze immediately landing on the impeccably dressed Wexlers and then sliding with disdain over Arya. "Yes," said Caroline, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at Arya. "This woman is blocking the way. She spilled coffee everywhere, and frankly, I don't think she belongs here. We are guests of the board." Richard Wexler gave Thorne a nod of recognition. "Richard Wexler, Wexler Capital. We're here for the ceremony. Just trying to get through." Thorne's demeanor changed instantly. He knew the name. Wexler Capital was a major player. He puffed out his chest and turned to Arya, his face a mask of official intolerance. "Mom," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The Wexlers are valued patrons of this airport. The ceremony is about to begin, and the main stage area is restricted. I'm going to have to ask you to please step aside." Arya looked from Thorne's smug face to Caroline's triumphant sneer. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She opened her mouth to speak, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on her, silencing her. "Step aside," Thorne repeated more firmly this time, gesturing with his hand, as if shooing away a stray dog. "Now, or I'll have to call security." The world seemed to shrink around Arya, condensing into the space between Marcus Thorne's dismissive gesture and the Wexlers' smug faces. The clinking of champagne glasses faded. The murmur of the crowd became a distant buzz. All she could hear was the blood pounding in her ears, and Thorne's final word, "Security." For a moment she was frozen. A part of her, the part that had been battered by grief and exhaustion for the past 3 years, wanted to simply nod, turn, and walk away. She could melt back into the anonymity she had grown accustomed to. She could find a quiet corner, wait until the ceremony was over, and leave. No one would notice. The check had been cashed, the building was built. Her part was done. But then her gaze drifted past Thorne's shoulder. Through a gap in the crowd, she saw it. Mounted on the vast marble wall behind the stage was a magnificent bronze plaque. She couldn't read the words from this distance, but she knew what they said. She had written them herself. The Sterling Vance International Wing. Dedicated to the memory of Captain David Sterling, and to all those who carry the spirit of exploration and connection in their hearts. May all who pass through these halls travel safely and return home. Suddenly, the weariness in her soul was replaced by a slow-burning fire. This wasn't just a building. It was a memorial. It was a promise. It was the last, most profound thing she could do for the man she had loved more than life itself. And these people, these shallow, self-important peacocks, were telling her she didn't belong in his monument. She took a slow, deliberate breath, the air filling her lungs and steadying her resolve. She looked directly at Marcus Thorne, her grey eyes, which had seemed so tired moments before, now clear and sharp as flint. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice low, but carrying a new, unexpected weight. Thorne was taken aback. He had expected her to scurry away. "There's no misunderstanding, Ma'am. This is a restricted area. Your invitation, if you even have one, clearly doesn't grant you access to the forward stage." He was doubling down, confident in his assessment of her status. "My invitation," Arya said, her voice still quiet, but now edged with steel, "is of a different nature." Caroline Wexler let out an incredulous laugh. "Oh, please, a different nature. What are you, a ghost? Just get out of the way. Richard, let's go." "This is ridiculous." Richard Wexler, however, paused. He was a man who had built his fortune by reading people, and for the first time he detected something in Arya's posture, a deep, unshakable certainty that gave him a flicker of pause. It was a look he'd seen in boardrooms just before a hostile takeover was announced. But he dismissed it. She was just a stubborn old woman. "Thorne," Richard said, his tone one of finality, "handle this." Thorne straightened his tie, his authority reasserted. "Ma'am, this is your final warning. Move, or I will have you escorted from the premises. You are disrupting a major civic event." Arya didn't move. She simply held his gaze. Her mind flashed back 3 years to another terminal. The old one. Dingy, crowded, inefficient. She remembered standing in a different, horribly sterile room in that old building, a room with fluorescent lights that hummed and made everyone look sick. A grim-faced airline official had stood before her, using the same bureaucratic, detached tone as Marcus Thorne. "Mrs. Sterling," the man had said, avoiding her eyes. "There was an incident on approach. Weather-related complications, outdated guidance systems. The response was delayed. We regret to inform you." That was the day her world had ended. David, her brilliant kind. Steady David was gone. He had been flying for 25 years. He could land a 747 in a crosswind with his eyes closed. But on that foggy night, a combination of outdated ground approach radar at the old underfunded terminal and pilot fatigue had created a fatal, unforgiving window of error. After the initial suffocating wave of grief came the anger. Not just at the airline, but at the systemic neglect. The airport was a cash cow for the city, yet its core infrastructure, the parts that kept people safe, had been left to decay. She had inherited a significant fortune from her own family, the Vances, who had been in shipping for generations. David had always joked that she was the one with the real capital, while he just had his head in the clouds. After his death, her fortune felt like an anchor, dragging her down into an ocean of meaningless sorrow. Then the idea came to her. A terrible, wonderful, impossibly expensive idea. She would not sue. She would not protest. She would rebuild. She would fund a new terminal herself, a state-of-the-art facility, where safety was the paramount design principle. A place worthy of David's memory. She did it anonymously, through a trust using only her initials, E.V. Sterling. It cost her nearly $1 billion more than half of her entire net worth. It was her penance, her tribute, her final love letter to him, and Marcus Thorne had just threatened to throw her out of it. The fire in her chest blazed hotter. "You will not," she said, the words cutting through the air, "be calling security." Arya's quiet, firm declaration hung in the air, creating a small bubble of silence around the tense group. For a moment, even Caroline Wexler was at a loss for a suitably sharp retort. There was a power in Arya's stillness that was deeply unsettling to people who equated power with noise and motion. Marcus Thorne, however, saw it as a direct challenge to his authority in his own domain. His face reddened. "Is that a threat, ma'am? Because I assure you the Port Authority Police—" "Marcus, what in God's name is going on here?" The new voice was calm but stern, cutting through Thorne's bluster. A young woman in a simple Port Authority blazer had pushed her way through the periphery of the crowd. She had a tablet in one hand and an earpiece in the other. Her name was Sophia Rossi, a junior events coordinator who was ferociously competent and perpetually overlooked by superiors like Thorne. Thorne turned annoyed at the interruption. "Sophia, this is not your concern. I'm handling a security issue. Go back to monitoring the catering." Sophia ignored him. Her eyes were wide, fixed on Aria. She had spent the last month coordinating with the mysterious benefactor's legal team. She had never met the woman, but she had seen the one and only approved press photo, a candid shot of a smiling woman with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair standing next to a handsome uniformed pilot. The photo had been provided for the dedication slideshow. Sophia's blood ran cold. It was her, the woman from the photo. "Mr. Thorne," Sophia whispered, her voice tight with panic as she tugged on his sleeve. "Sir, you need to stop." "Stop what?" Thorne hissed, pulling his arm away. "Stop doing my job. This woman is being disruptive." "No, she's—" Sophia looked at Aria, her expression a mixture of awe and mortification. "Ma'am, Mrs. Vance Sterling, is that you?" The name dropped into the conversation like a stone. Vance Sterling. It was the name on the plaque, the name on the program, the name of the entire wing. Caroline Wexler's perfectly sculpted eyebrows shot up. She looked from the drab woman in the coffee-stained coat to the massive bronze plaque and back again. The connection failed to compute. It was impossible. "What did you call her?" she asked Sophia, her tone incredulous. Richard Wexler's practiced smile finally faltered. He was quicker on the uptake. "Vance, an old money-shipping name. Sterling, the name of the terminal." His mind, trained to spot hidden values and liabilities, started racing. He felt a prickle of unease. Thorne, however, was too deep in his own arrogance to see the truth. He scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous, Sophia. This is not Mrs. Sterling. Mrs. Sterling is a major philanthropist, a dignitary. She wouldn't be dressed like this. She's probably already seated on the stage." He hadn't actually met the benefactor. All communication had been through lawyers and trusts, a fact that had wounded his pride immensely. He had constructed an image in his mind of a titan of industry dripping with jewels. "Sir, I'm telling you," Sophia pleaded, her voice cracking. "Look at the photo from the press kit. It's her." At that moment, the lights in the grand concourse dimmed slightly. A hush fell over the crowd as a distinguished silver-haired man walked to the podium on the stage. It was Mayor Thompson. "Welcome, everyone." The mayor's voice boomed through the high-tech sound system. "Welcome to a new gateway for our magnificent city, a project born of vision generosity and a profound commitment to the future." The Wexlers and Thorne were momentarily distracted, turning their attention to the stage. This was the moment they had been waiting for. This terminal, the Sterling Vance International Wing, the mayor continued, stands as a testament to what one person's incredible spirit can achieve. For years we struggled with funding, with bureaucracy, with a dozen hurdles. Then a guardian angel appeared. Aria watched her heart, a painful drum against her ribs. This entire project was made possible by a single, breathtakingly generous donation. The mayor announced, his voice filled with genuine reverence. A gift given not for fame or recognition, but for a deeply personal and noble reason. It was given in memory of a hero, Captain David Sterling, and it was given by his remarkable wife, a woman of incredible strength and humility. Caroline Wexler preened slightly, imagining the benefactor was someone in her social circle. She shot another venomous look toward Arya, as if to say, "See, this is about important people." Marcus Thorne had a self-satisfied smile on his face, as if he himself had secured the funding. He was already imagining the promotion this project would bring him. "It is my profound honor," the mayor's voice swelled, "to ask her to join me on stage now. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a round of applause for the woman who built this future for us, Mrs. Arya Vance Sterling." A spotlight flared to life, sweeping across the front rows searching. The crowd erupted in applause, and in the small, tense circle of people, time stood still. Sophia Rossi looked like she was about to be physically ill. Richard Wexler's face had gone completely pale, the blood draining from it, as if a plug had been pulled. He stared at Arya, his mind finally horrifically connecting every single dot. Caroline Wexler's jaw was slack, her mouth slightly open. The smugness had evaporated, replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. And Marcus Thorne looked as if the marble floor had just turned to quicksand beneath his feet. He stared at the unassuming woman in the stained grey coat, the woman he had threatened and belittled, the woman he had ordered to step aside. His career, his ambition, his entire future flashed before his eyes, and he saw it all turning to dust. Arya met his terrified gaze for a fraction of a second. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a deep, abiding sorrow. Then she turned and began to walk toward the stage. As Arya walked toward the stage, each step felt both impossibly heavy and strangely light. The applause was a roaring wave, but in her mind it was silent. She was walking through a memory, a landscape of pain that had forged her purpose. The faces of the Wexlers and Marcus Thorne, masks of crumbling arrogance, were already fading from her mind, replaced by a much more powerful image, the tired, kind face of Arthur Sterling, David's father. The story didn't begin with David's plane crash. It began 5 years earlier, in a quiet suburban home in New Jersey. Arthur Sterling was a retired factory foreman, a man who had worked at the same plant for 40 years. He was the embodiment of the post-war American dream work: hard, save your money, provide for your family, and enjoy a modest, secure retirement. His entire life savings, his pension, and his 401k were managed by a portfolio of what he thought were stable blue-chip investments. Then came the restructuring. A sleek, aggressive private equity firm from Manhattan had swept in and bought the parent company of the factory where Arthur had worked. The firm was called Wexler Capital. Richard Wexler's strategy was infamous on Wall Street, though celebrated in certain circles for its brutal efficiency. He would acquire a company with significant assets, particularly one with a well-funded pension plan. Then, using a series of complex and legally dubious maneuvers, he would load the acquired company with debt, sell off its most valuable assets, and terminate the pension plan, replacing it with cheap, high-risk annuities. The process hollowed out the company, leaving it a shell of its former self. But not before Wexler and his investors had extracted hundreds of millions of dollars. The employees and retirees were left with pennies on the dollar. Arthur Sterling, at 72 years old, lost everything. His pension, which was supposed to be his bedrock, vanished. His life savings evaporated. The man who had been a pillar of strength, his whole life, was broken. He and his wife had to sell their home, the one David grew up in, and move into a tiny, cramped apartment. The shame and stress took a visible toll on his health. David, who idolized his father, was consumed by a quiet, burning rage. He watched the man who had taught him how to be a man, reduced to depending on his son for financial support. It was a reversal of the natural order that David found deeply offensive. "They're vultures," El David had said to Arya one night, sitting at their kitchen table, his pilot's uniform hanging in the closet. He was staring at a stack of his father's medical bills. "They don't build anything. They just pick at the bones of what other people built." To help his parents, David began picking up extra shifts, long-haul international flights, red-eyes, grueling turnarounds that left him perpetually jet-lagged. Arya had begged him to slow down. They had more than enough money. Her family's wealth could have supported his parents 100 times over. But for David, it was a matter of pride, of duty. "It's my job to take care of them now, El," he insisted. "It's my responsibility. I won't let that shark Wexler beat my dad." So he flew. He flew when he was tired. He flew when he should have been resting. He pushed his body to the limits, chasing paychecks to restore the dignity that Richard Wexler had stolen from his family. Arya lived in a state of constant low-grade anxiety. Every time his plane took off, a part of her went with it. Every call from an unknown number made her heart seize. Then came the call she had always dreaded. It was a foggy Tuesday night. The preliminary report cited a confluence of factors: a sudden microburst of wind shear on final approach, a momentary lag in the outdated ground radar system at the old JFK terminal, which failed to provide an immediate update on the rapidly changing conditions, and as the final report would delicately phrase it, contributing human factors, including potential fatigue. Arya knew what that meant. David was exhausted. He was exhausted from the extra flights. He was exhausted from the worry for his father. And in that critical split second, when he needed every ounce of his legendary skill, the fatigue had claimed its due. A half-second of delayed reaction, a fatal miscalculation. The irony was the cruelest part. David had died, trying to financially recover from the damage wrought by a man like Richard Wexler, and his death was partially caused by the crumbling infrastructure of a city that men like Richard Wexler profited from but never invested in. After the funeral, as Arya sat in the silence of her empty home, the plan began to form. It was a plan born of grief and fury. She would use her money, the Vance money, to right a cosmic wrong. She couldn't get her husband back. She couldn't restore his father's health. Arthur had passed away from a heart attack 6 months after the crash, a broken man. But she could build something. She contacted her lawyers and set up the anonymous trust, the E.V. Sterling Trust. She laid out her conditions. The new terminal had to have the most advanced avionics guidance systems and safety protocols in the world. It had to be a place of light and air, a place that felt safe and welcoming, not grim and oppressive. And it had to be named for David. She had never met Richard Wexler. She only knew his name from the documents Arthur had shown her, and from David's bitter, angry rants late at night. She knew he was a predator who moved in the highest circles of New York finance. She never imagined in a million years that he would be standing here today, that fate or karma or whatever one chose to call it would deliver her antagonist directly to the foot of her monument, dripping with the same arrogance that had destroyed her family. The realization was not triumphant. It was chilling. It felt like the closing of a circle drawn by an unseen, impartial hand of justice. As she reached the steps to the stage, she glanced back. Richard Wexler was staring at her, his face a ghastly shade of white. He knew. In his eyes, she saw not just the shock of a social faux pas, but the dawning terror of a man who suddenly realizes he has taunted a ghost, and that ghost has come to collect a debt. Arya ascended the 3 short steps to the stage. The warmth of the spotlight was a physical presence, But she felt a strange calm settle over her. The mayor, a man she had only ever spoken to through her lawyers, shook her hand, his expression one of genuine gratitude and admiration. "Mrs. Vance Sterling," he murmured, his voice low, so only she could hear. "On behalf of the city of New York, thank you. What you have done is a miracle." Arya gave him a small, sad smile and nodded. She walked to the podium, adjusting the microphone. Her hands, which had been trembling just minutes ago, were now perfectly steady. She looked out over the sea of faces, politicians, business leaders, socialites, and her gaze swept past them, settling for a moment on the small, disgraced group standing by the column. Caroline Wexler looked as if she had been struck by lightning, her face frozen in a mask of horror. Marcus Thorne was visibly sweating under the stage lights, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape route. But it was Richard Wexler who held Arya's attention. He was no longer looking at her. He was staring at the floor, his shoulders slumped. The predator had become the prey. Arya unfolded the papers from her worn leather portfolio. She looked down at the words she had so carefully crafted, the sanitized, dignified speech about legacy and the future of travel. And in that moment, she knew she couldn't read it. The sanitized version was a lie. The truth of this place, the blood and tears mixed into its foundation, demanded to be spoken. She set the papers aside. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice clear and resonant, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system. It carried a quiet authority that immediately commanded the room's full attention. "Mayor Thompson, distinguished guests, thank you for that warm welcome." She paused, taking a breath. "You are standing in a building born from a great love and a great loss. This is the Sterling Vance International Wing. The Vance is my name. The Sterling belongs to my late husband, Captain David Sterling." A murmur of sympathy went through the crowd. Many knew the terminal was a memorial, but the details had been kept private. "David loved to fly," she continued, her voice thick with emotion, but never wavering. "He believed that flying was a form of magic. He said it was the business of connecting people, of bringing families together, of making the world a little smaller, a little more understanding. He gave his life to that profession." She let that hang in the air for a moment. "He died 3 years ago, on approach to this very airport. And while we can blame weather or mechanics, the truth is often more complex. Systems matter. Infrastructure matters. And the integrity of the people who oversee those systems matters most of all." Out in the crowd, Marcus Thorne flinched as if he'd been slapped. "I built this terminal," Arya said, her gaze sweeping across the room, "to ensure that the systems here are the safest in the world, so that no other family has to get the call that I did because of aging equipment or neglected protocols." She then turned her focus slightly, her voice taking on a sharper, more deliberate edge. "But this building is about more than just physical safety. It's about a different kind of integrity, too. My husband was a man of profound character. He believed in hard work, in keeping your word, in the idea that you build a life and a community by contributing, not by taking." Her eyes found Richard Wexler again. He finally looked up, and their gazes locked across the crowded room. There was no one else in the world for that one searing second. He watched his own father, a man who worked for 40 years at one company, lose his entire life savings. His pension, his security, his dignity, all of it was stripped away by financial predators. Vultures in expensive suits who produce nothing but who grow rich by destroying the lives of working people. A shocked silence fell over the room. This was not the celebratory speech anyone had expected. On the side of the room, a reporter for the Wall Street Journal there to cover the society event, began typing furiously into his phone. He knew the rumors that had been swirling around Wexler Capital for months. This was the human angle he'd been missing. My husband, David, worked himself to exhaustion to try and repair the damage those people had caused his family. Arya said, her voice dropping to an almost whisper, raw with pain. The fatigue from that burden contributed to his death. The connection was now explicit, a thunderclap in the silent hall. Caroline Wexler let out a small, strangled gasp. Everyone knew who the titans of private equity were. While Arya had not used his name in that room, she didn't have to. Dozens of heads subtly turned towards Richard Wexler. So yes, Arya concluded, bringing her speech to a powerful close, her voice ringing with conviction. I built this terminal as a monument to my husband, but it is also a statement. It is a statement that we must build things that last. We must build with integrity. We must protect the vulnerable from the voracious. And we must remember that a person's true worth is not measured by the height of their stock portfolio, but by the strength of their character and the legacy of decency they leave behind. Thank you. She stepped back from the podium. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. The air was thick with the weight of her words. Then one person began to clap. Then another. Within seconds, the entire room, save for 3 shattered individuals by a column, was on its feet, delivering a thunderous, heartfelt standing ovation that was more for the woman than for the building. The standing ovation for Arya was not merely applause, it was a judgment. It roared through the grand concourse, a wave of sound that seemed to physically push back against the arrogance that had held sway just moments before. But around the column where the Wexlers and Marcus Thorne stood, the air was unnaturally still, and cold a vacuum of silence in the eye of the storm. The first shift was subtle. It was in the eyes of the people nearby. The initial looks of shock directed at the Wexlers began to curdle into something else. Comprehension, followed by a cold, cutting disdain. A prominent real estate developer who had been trying to curry favor with Richard all evening suddenly found a fascinating piece of art to inspect on the far wall. A society columnist who had been air-kissing with Caroline earlier now angled her body away, creating a physical barrier. The Wexlers, who had moved through this crowd like sharks parting water, suddenly found themselves on a tiny, shrinking island, the sea of high society receding from their shores. Marcus Thorne felt the chill first. He was a creature of social barometers, and every needle on his internal dashboard was screaming danger. He saw his boss, Port Authority Director Janet Riley, standing on the stage next to the mayor. Her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on him. It was not a look of anger. It was far worse. It was a look of clinical assessment, the kind a surgeon gives a malignancy before excision. On the edge of the crowd, Ben Carter, a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He had been sent to write a fluffy, human interest piece on the new terminal. But for months, he'd been chasing whispers on a much bigger story, a major SEC investigation into Wexler Capital. He had sources, he had data, but he lacked the narrative, the human cost. Arya Vance Sterling had just handed it to him on a silver platter, wrapped in tragedy and tied with a bow of pure steel. He pulled out his phone fingers, flying across the screen in a message to his editor. Story of the year, Wexler Capital Pension Scandal, confirmed by JFK benefactor. Her family were victims. Tying it to terminal dedication, it's a goddamn Greek tragedy. Dropping everything. Sending draft in 20. He didn't wait for a reply. He began to write. As the applause for Arya began to subside, Janet Riley descended from the stage. She moved with a purpose that made people instinctively step out of her path. She ignored the Wexlers completely, her eyes locked on her subordinate. "Thorne," she said. Her voice was quiet, yet it cut through the lingering buzz of the crowd. "Director Riley Janet, I can explain everything." He began, his voice slick with a desperate, practiced smoothness. It was a chaotic situation. There was a misunderstanding with the guest list, and this woman, Janet interrupted, her voice dropping lower, colder, is the sole reason this building exists. This woman, Marcus, is the only person in this entire room who truly mattered today. And you, in a spectacular failure of the most basic tenets of your job observation, decorum and simple human decency, threatened to have her removed. I was trying to protect our other patrons, the Wexlers," he stammered, gesturing weakly toward Richard. "It was the wrong thing to say." "You were protecting a man whose name, in about 5 minutes, is going to be synonymous with fraud," Janet said, her eyes flashing with contempt. "You chose a predator over a philanthropist. You valued a flashy suit over a noble heart. This isn't a misunderstanding, Marcus. It is a fundamental flaw in your character. It is a flaw the Port Authority can no longer afford." She paused, letting the weight of her words crush him. "Go to your office. Pack your personal effects. Security will escort you from the building. You are done here." Marcus Thorne's face went slack, the color draining from it. The sounds of the room seemed to fade into a distant roar. His ambition, his meticulously crafted career path, his very identity as a man of importance, it all crumbled into dust at his feet. At that exact moment, Richard Wexler's phone buzzed in his pocket. It felt less like a vibration and more like an electric shock. The name on the screen was Robert Aiken, legal. His heart seized. His top lawyer never called in the middle of a social event unless the world was ending. He stumbled away from his family, turning his back to the crowd, as if to hide. "Bob," he rasped into the phone. He listened, his body growing rigid. His knuckles gripping the phone turned white. He didn't speak, but his face told the entire story. The blood drained from his cheeks, his jaw went slack, and his eyes, once so sharp and predatory, became vacant with horror. The indictment was unsealed. The assets were being frozen. It was over. As he lowered the phone, the second wave hit. All around the room, a new sound began to rise, the soft chime of news alerts. One phone lit up, then 5, then 50. A constellation of screens illuminating shocked faces. Ben Carter's story, fast-tracked by his editor, had just hit the WSJ Newswire, perfectly timed with the official SEC press release. Billion-dollar benefactor at JFK dedication exposes Wexler Capital in stinging rebuke. SEC files, sweeping fraud charges against Richard Wexler, alleges massive pension scheme. The whispers exploded into a roar of conversation. The names Wexler and fraud were on everyone's lips. The isolation of the Wexler family was now complete. They were lepers. "Richard, what is it?" Caroline shrieked, finally realizing this was an apocalypse, not a faux pas. She grabbed his arm, her manicured nails digging into his expensive suit. "Richard, do something." But Richard couldn't move. He was a statue of ruin. Their children, Mason and Chloe, stood beside them, their faces pale with a confusion that was rapidly turning to fear. Their entire universe, built on the bedrock of their father's invincibility, was liquefying. And then the final actors in the tragedy made their entrance. 2 men and a woman, dressed in plain conservative suits, entered the concourse from a side entrance. They moved with an unnerving calm, their eyes scanning the room. They weren't press. They weren't guests. They were federal agents. The crowd seemed to sense their purpose parting before them as they made a direct line for the column of shame. They stopped in front of Richard Wexler. Richard Wexler, the lead agent, asked, his voice devoid of all emotion. Richard gave a slow, numb nod. "You are under arrest for violations of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act and multiple counts of wire fraud." The agent's words were crisp, professional, and utterly devastating. "You have the right to remain silent." Caroline let out a gut-wrenching scream of denial. "No, this is a mistake, you can't. We are. My husband is—" She couldn't finish the sentence. What was he now? The agent's partner gently but firmly took Richard's arm. As the reality set in, the press, who had been held back by a velvet rope, broke through. The room erupted in a blinding chaos of flashing lights. The flashbulbs were like lightning, catching strobe-lit images of the carnage Richard's blank, defeated face. Caroline's mascara-streaked, contorted mask of despair. Marcus Thorne standing alone, a ghost already forgotten. And on the stage, Aria Vance Sterling, watching the brutal, brilliant, terrible explosion of justice she had so quietly ignited. The autumn that followed the explosive dedication ceremony was one of quiet, inexorable change. The Sterling Vance International Wing, cleansed of its dramatic birth, settled into its intended purpose. It became a beloved part of New York's fabric, a humming, vibrant artery, through which the lifeblood of the city flowed. Travelers spoke of its light, its efficiency, and an intangible feeling of peace that seemed to permeate the air. The story of its dedication became a piece of New York folklore, a cautionary tale about arrogance and the quiet power of integrity. The echoes of that day rippled outwards, reshaping the lives it had touched. Marcus Thorne, a man undone by a single catastrophic lapse in judgment, vanished from the city's professional landscape. After being summarily fired, he found himself unemployable in any executive capacity in the tri-state area. The last anyone heard, he had taken a significant demotion to a logistics management role at a much smaller airport in Ohio, his name a permanent synonym for sycophantic failure. The Wexler name, once a symbol of ruthless financial power, was now irrevocably linked to disgrace. Caroline Wexler, stripped of her social standing and facing a mountain of legal bills, quietly filed for divorce and retreated to a family property in the Hamptons, emerging only for court-mandated appearances. Her fuchsia coat and haughty demeanor became the subject of mocking memes. Her son and daughter transferred to schools out of state, desperate to escape the toxic fallout of their family name. Richard Wexler's downfall was absolute. His trial was a media sensation, a textbook case of corporate greed. One by one, former employees and victims, emboldened by Aria's public stand, came forward to testify. Convicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering, he was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. The federal government seized the vast majority of Wexler Capital's assets, using them to establish a massive restitution fund for the thousands of pensioners whose lives his firm had systematically dismantled. It wouldn't restore their lost years or erase their hardship, but for many it was the first glimmer of justice they had ever seen. Aria Vance Sterling watched these events from a distance, reading the news, not with glee, but with a grim sense of finality. Her war was over. The monument was built, the karmic debt had been paid. But as the noise faded, she was left in the quiet aftermath, facing the question that had haunted her for 3 years. What now? She found the answer, not in New York, but in a modest sunlit office in Chicago, overlooking Millennium Park. She had established the Arthur Sterling Memorial Foundation, named for David's broken-hearted father. Its mission was simple and direct, to provide top-tier legal aid and financial counseling to victims of pension fraud and corporate malfeasance. One crisp November afternoon, Aria sat at her desk, engaged in a video call. On the screen was a man in his late 60s, with the strong hands and weary eyes of a lifelong steelworker. His name was Robert Henderson, and he was the Foundation's first official case. I don't know how to thank you, Mrs. Vance Sterling." Robert said, his voice thick with an emotion he was struggling to contain. "For 20 years we've been fighting these people. We sent letters we called politicians. Nobody listened. They took everything my wife and I saved. Said it was a necessary restructuring. They called it that. Like we were just numbers on a spreadsheet. I know the language they use." "Robert," Arya said, her voice gentle. "They use it to hide the fact that they are breaking people's lives. When I read about what you did in New York and what you said about your husband's family, it was like you were telling my story." He continued, wiping at his eye. "And now this. Your lawyers, they think we can actually get a real settlement. They're terrifying," he added with a slight, watery chuckle. "In a good way." "They are the best," Arya confirmed with a small smile. "And they will fight for you until the very end. You just focus on you and your wife. Let us handle the fight." After the call ended, Arya sat in the silence for a long moment. This felt more real than the grand terminal. The applause, the downfall of Richard Wexler, that was a loud, singular explosion. This was different. This was the quiet, patient work of rebuilding. A month later, for the first time since the dedication, she returned to JFK. Not as a benefactor, but as a passenger. She had booked a flight to London to visit an old university friend, a deliberate step towards reconnecting with her own life beyond the shadow of the monument. Walking through the Sterling Vance wing was a surreal experience. It was alive with the music of travel, the happy shrieks of children seeing an airplane up close, the emotional greetings of families being reunited, the rhythmic roll of thousands of suitcases. She saw a young Port Authority employee patiently giving directions to an elderly couple, his smile genuine, his demeanor respectful. She saw in him the legacy of Sophia Rossi, now the terminal's director of guest experience, who had instilled a new culture of compassion and service in the staff. Anonymously, she bought a coffee and sat near the grand windows, watching the planes take off and land. No one recognized her. She was just another woman in a simple coat, another face in the crowd. And it was wonderful. Her eyes were drawn inevitably to the great bronze plaque on the far wall. She didn't need to walk over. She knew the words by heart, dedicated to the memory of Captain David Sterling. May all who pass through these halls travel safely and return home. A young family, a mother and father with 2 small children, stood before the plaque, the father quietly reading the inscription to his son who was perched on his shoulders. The boy pointed a small finger at the bronze lettering. "Like a superhero, Daddy?" the boy asked. "Yes, son," the father said softly. "Like a superhero." Tears welled in Arya's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of peace. She finally understood. Her victory wasn't Richard Wexler in handcuffs. Her revenge wasn't Caroline Wexler's social ruin. Her triumph wasn't even in the standing ovation. It was here. It was in the quiet hum of 1,000 safe journeys. It was in Robert Henderson's hopeful smile on a computer screen. It was in a little boy looking up at her husband's name and thinking of a hero. She had built a fortress to keep the memory of her great love safe. But now she saw it wasn't a fortress at all. It was a beacon, and its light was just beginning to spread. Finishing her coffee, Arya Vance Sterling stood up, pulled her small carry-on bag behind her, and walked toward her gate, a quiet, invisible woman finally ready for her own journey forward. Arya Vance Sterling's story is a powerful reminder that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's a quiet, unshakable resolve in the face of arrogance. It's a testament to the fact that you can't judge a person's worth by their coat or their title. The Wexlers and Marcus Thorne made that mistake. They saw a nobody and told her to step aside, only to have the entire world shift beneath their feet. They learned the hard way that karma isn't just a concept. Sometimes it's a billion-dollar terminal named after the family you destroyed. This story is about more than just revenge. It's about turning profound pain into purpose. It's about building a legacy of integrity from the ashes of betrayal. If this story of poetic justice and quiet strength resonated with you, please help us share it. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who would appreciate it, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more true life stories where the overlooked and underestimated finally get their due. What did you think of Aria's ultimate response? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching.